Welcome. We are going to start our webinar today. So this is the fifth session of the webinar series on urban-rural linkages in the time of COVID-19. Today's session, we are going to look at neighborhood governance and community response through the lens of urban-rural linkages. This webinar is jointly organized by UN Habitat with the Centre for Sustainable, Healthy and Learning Cities and Neighbourhoods, SHLC of the University of Glasgow in Scotland. My name is Camilo Romero, and I am part of the UN Habitat Urban-Rural Linkages team. Our team belongs to the Policy, Legislation and Governance section of the Urban Practices branch, UN Habitat. My colleagues Eo Chae, Sun Lei, Alice Hussein, and Grace Gidiri are also part of this team and are supporting the organization of this webinar. I also would like to thank you to Professor Yaping Wang and Gail Wilson and Jennifer MacArthur from the Center for Sustainable, Healthy and Learning Cities and Neighborhoods, who are also part of the organizing team. Today, I'm going to be hosting this webinar, and to start and supporting Remy Sechipin, who is going to start today's webinar with the opening remarks. Remy is the head of Policy, Legislation and Governance section at UN Habitat. And after Remy's opening remarks and introduction to today's discussions, we are going to have our speakers. And then we can move on to the discussion, and then Remy will be closing again and providing us some takeaways and highlights of this discussion. So yes, now I would like to hand the floor to Remy. So Remy, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Camilo. Welcome everyone. This is the fifth edition of the webinar series on urban-rural linkages in the time of COVID. So I would take maybe just 3 segments in my presentation, just to give you, for those who have not attended the previous session, what we have done, and maybe the purpose of this particular one. Then later, just give you a kind of snapshot of what UN Habitat is doing on urban-rural linkages as related. So for this, we are celebrating our 1-month anniversary. As Camilo said, I lead the team here on policy, legislation and governance, with one of the key pillars of our work being on urban-rural linkages. So this webinar series on demand and looking into this emerging issue of COVID-19. And we are trying to understand how urban-rural linkages are playing a role in this emerging and evolving issue. So for those who might not be aware, we have been using different scale of intervention, understanding starting the first one on May 4th, 2020, to understand from 3 countries, the United States, China, and Colombia, how they are trying to address this particular issue. Then we move into the second week, that was 14th of May, understanding at metropolitan scale what is happening. So we have speakers from Guadalajara in Mexico, Grenoble up in France, and the World Association of the Mayor Metropolis, who enlightened us on what metropolitan areas are doing. So after that, we moved on the 21st of May, where we actually try to understand the role of small towns and intermediate cities in addressing the pandemic. And in this case, we have more institutions. You have the International Labour Organization working in Mozambique. We have the OECD, we have UCLG, and we have Oppersland in the Netherlands, presenting what they are actually doing from the global to some concrete example like Mozambique and the Netherlands. So the last week we looked we went a bit further down and started our series working with our partner at the University of Glasgow to look at the role of, you know, the impact on slum dwellers. But this one today, the 4th of June, we are even going at a more granular level, looking at the neighborhood level, but at the governance of COVID in particular at that level. So this is how we have been evolving, discussing, learning, building our understanding, our appreciation of the role of urban linkages and different dimensions throughout. So I don't know if Camilo, who we post the PowerPoint, would that me or that coming from? Okay. So just for those who are not quite aware what UN Habitat is doing on the urban linkages for the last couple of years, on the next slide, we move to the next slide if you can. So for this had been gaining more momentum, more interest from different partners. One of the key instruments we have been using had been the development of the Urban-Rural Linkages guiding principle and the action framework to support those, which took some time, very participatory process. And within had 10 principles that you might be aware of. And in this series of webinars, we are actually highlighting some of these principles that we need. And then we have a series of actions in the next slide that demonstrate what are the most relevant principles within the 10 that are talking directly to the COVID-19. The next slide will show us some of the key areas of intervention, how we're going about this. Usually we have 5 areas where we develop this type of normative work, including the principle. For instance, we have a series of instruments to enable this understanding to be grounded. We have a series of learning, capacity development that are supporting the work on urban linkages. And we have a series of materials that are available free of charge, or you can download from UN Habitat website and so forth. We have a training manual that takes you through how we go about addressing or engaging different actors on the urban-rural continuum. I think the next one talks about different instruments, different countries and activities we have in different part of the world to support this, and different partners with whom we are working within the United Nations, in Spain, and so forth, to advance this particular area in different countries, in Africa, in Latin America, and so forth. On the next slide, we also have an area of work that touches very much on the advocacy and partnership, where we go from having global references or areas of engagement through the International Forum on Urban-Rural Linkages. We have regular newsletters that we release. We have this webinar series that we are running to understand. We have a website that is a repository of resources that we have available. I think so we have these resources available. So this is just to give you the context under which we are operating, and the urban-rural linkages being very much topic and issue relevant. It's not by chance that we are talking about health, well-being, and COVID-19 in the context of urban-rural linkages. And we hope that as we engage further in this discussion, we're going to learn more. We're going to really appreciate the importance of leaving no one and no place behind. Camilo, I will stop here so that you can proceed with the webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Remy. Yeah, so yeah, we are going to start with today's presentation. We are going to open the discussion, and for that, I would like to introduce the speakers. But before that, like I see that we have people from connecting from many parts of the world. Have people from Bangladesh, Nigeria, Somalia, Accra, Ghana, Morocco, London, Indonesia, also Scotland, Canada, China. So thank you all. Also from Paraguay, Austria. I'm seeing here more people in the chat telling us where are they connecting from. But yeah, so to start the discussion, as I was saying before, so today we have four speakers. So we are going to start with Maria Teresa Nogales, who is the founder and executive director at Alternativas Foundation in Bolivia. Then we move to Mario Delos-Reyes, who is from the University of Philippines and also is co-investigator of the Center for Sustainable, Healthy and Learning Cities and Neighborhoods. Then we will have Erika Salem, that is a program officer at Montréal on santé. That I think it has to do, the name has to do with health. And closing today's session, we will have Francis Levira from Ifakara Health Institute in Tanzania. And also Francis is co-investigator of the Center for Sustainable, Healthy and Learning Cities and Neighborhoods. So yes, so to start with, just going to give a couple of remarks for our speakers today. So you will have 10 minutes for your presentations. After 9 minutes, I will let you know that you have 1 minute left in order to wrap up and make sure that you deliver the messages that you want to share today with us. So yeah, so Maria Teresa Nogales, please, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Camilo. Very good morning. Good morning to everybody, or good afternoon, good evening also. I guess we're all signing in from different time zones. Thank you so much to UN Habitat for the invitation. And I saw Thomas Forster's already signed in, so I just want to send a special hello to Thomas. I guess I'm going to start by sharing the Bolivian experience. So I think it's important to start out by saying that Bolivia, much like any other country around the world, was really caught by surprise by the pandemic, and the pandemic actually caught us at a moment in which our local food systems are rather weak, because we've been increasingly depending on the importation of food, and we have a very strong rural to urban migration tendency. And so our food systems aren't necessarily in the best shape. In addition, the pandemic forced our countries around the world to shut international borders, which means obviously less goods are coming in. And the quarantine measures that were determined very early on in Bolivia actually didn't contemplate special permissions for food system actors. And so everybody was suddenly shut up in their home, whether they lived in rural areas, small cities, large cities, metropolitan areas. And everybody was very confused about what was happening and who was actually going to be in charge of making sure that people respecting quarantine were going to access basic necessity items. And in addition to that, I think it's important to note that unfortunately, at the local level, most municipalities in Bolivia don't actually have food contingency plans. And so I think that really there was a lot of variables that made us question whether we were going to be able to make it through quarantine and the pandemic in one piece. So I guess, let's see if I can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen. Yeah.
Okay.
So can you try to make a full display, full presentation? But so it's also good. So you can continue, no problem.
Oh, are you seeing the uh-oh. Or maybe, can you help me, Camilo, perhaps with?
We can display that for you, no problem. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that might be better because my screen is splitting for some reason, so I can't seem to. So if you can help me out. So while Camilo helps me out with the PowerPoint, sorry about that. I think it's important to note that you know, when we talk about food security and guaranteeing the right to food and making sure people can access food in a timely manner and in the quantities that are necessary, you know, we're talking about 4 different variables that need to be present at all times. So we need to have food available to people where they are. People need to have physical access and economic access to food. But additionally, we as people need to give food an appropriate use. And then, of course, according to the FAO, we need to ensure stability of the other 3 pillars of food security to actually say that we have the conditions necessary to guarantee food security. So if we part from this interpretation of what is food security, then Camilo, if you can pass on to the next. I think what's been really interesting is to see how there has been a sum of many efforts in Bolivia to make sure that people can have been able to access food. So we've actually been in quarantine for 10 weeks. This week, quarantine measures have been flexibilized, but it's very likely that as of next week, we're going to go back into quarantine. And I think it's also important to note that Bolivia still registers a very high percentage of low-income households, households living in extreme poverty. And yes, there has been a lot of economic development and a lot of progress in terms of getting people out of poverty, but they're still on that threshold between, you know, really making it out of poverty or just temporarily being out of poverty. And so I think it's important to note, you know, the government initially has obviously prioritized low-income households, and for this, you know, there were cash transfers made available to different vulnerable groups. There was food baskets delivered to thousands of homes all over the country. And the police and the military were certainly deployed to help out with different logistics. Additionally, as you can see, you know, Camilo, if you just want to start passing the PowerPoint, the photos, there's not that many pictures, there's about 12. But I think it's interesting to see that, you know, different sectors of society were able to contribute with, you know, something that would help reach a different population and ensure that by many people contributing at the same time, you could actually reach a larger percent of people and a larger number of people. So the private sector, of course, also stepped up to the plate. They offered a lot of logistical support. The National Beer Company, for example, made their trucks and drivers available to deploy mobile markets and to transport health goods and health services to neighborhoods in the periphery. They also made a lot of in-kind donations, whether that be cleaning supplies, health supplies, biosecurity supplies, food supplies. They also added resources to increase the number of food baskets that were destined to low-income households. A lot of people, a lot of private sector companies also ensured that orphanages and hospitals were able to receive in-kind food donations. And of course, you know, the private sector has also lent its expertise and its services to help with, you know, food deliveries and this sorts of stuff. But additionally, what's been interesting is the work that civil society has been able to contribute. And there, I think, you know, there's been such a variety of initiatives. So, you know, a lot of CSOs were able to set up helplines or hotlines to help people either, you know, living with, you know, living in situations of domestic violence, or people who were having, you know, psychological issues handling, you know, quarantine, etc. A lot of CSOs were also able to deploy public opinion polling. Fundación Alternativas, for example, did a lot of that so that we could understand, you know, where food was perhaps not in sufficient supply. A lot of CSOs also helped out with the design and delivery of communication strategies. And a lot of CSOs, interestingly enough, leveraged these short circuit market chains. And so a lot of civil society organizations over the last few years have really been working with rural farmers to help them design and establish direct contact with urban markets. And so it's been really interesting. I mean, I think those are short chains that were not given a lot of attention over the last few years. And in this context, they were able to really come to the rescue in a lot of ways. And I think people are starting to really value and understand the importance of, you know, having this permanent communication and direct contact between urban and rural areas. And I think those are one of the opportunities that this pandemic has really lent the world and food chains everywhere. And then I think what's interesting is that, you know, the government was also able to invite and leverage the participation of local citizen representatives. So Bolivia has a very rich social structure. And in one of the pictures, Camilo, if you want to go back, we can see one of the indigenous leaders working with the military to ensure people are actually respecting social distancing norms. These were markets that were able to set up in smaller communities between urban and rural areas so that people could access food, you know, so they were taking dry goods from the urban areas to these markets and fresh foods from the rural areas to these markets. And so, but of course, because you had a lot of people meeting in these markets where there's not a lot of infrastructure, it was interesting to see how, you know, indigenous community leaders were called to participate and support these initiatives. And so they did a lot of mobile market oversight, but they also assisted with food basket delivery, and they assisted the authorities in identifying vulnerable homes so that additional help could be channeled to these homes specifically. And then I think, you know, another piece of the pie is certainly, you know, the citizenry itself, the citizenry that is not necessarily organized. And that's been really interesting because there were conflicts, political conflicts in October that led to a change of government here. But during the 7 weeks that we lived through a political crisis in Bolivia, citizens actually started to organize using social media. And so we were able to keep those platforms and those networks. And so all of these networks really started to come back to life in times of the pandemic. And so you see, you know, these networks, whether they're neighborhood or building networks, really, you know, contact certain food producers that they know, set up their own short chain markets, channel donations, conduct some independent delivery services primarily for poor communities and senior citizens. There's been a lot of, thank you. Okay, and there's been a lot of online fundraising. But additionally, what's been really interesting And the next slide, I think, is all the online cooking courses that citizens have been independently organizing, so that people who had become very accustomed to eating outside the home and who are now in quarantine and faced with the responsibility to cook their own food. So you have these platforms, teaching people how to cook very economically and very practically, so as to not risk affecting your health during this quarantine. So the next slide is actually the last slide, and it's just to kind of highlight that I think the success of what we've been able to leverage in Bolivia actually has to do with the sum of the many efforts put forth by different sectors. And I think we still have a lot to learn. I think the pandemic will have effects in the medium and long term, but I think around the world we're all learning that solidarity and resilience come hand in hand, and I hope that I'm looking forward to learning from what's been going on in other countries, and I hope this is helpful to people in other countries as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Maria Teresa, for sharing with us today the experience in Bolivia, which I find very, very interesting. And just to highlight one of the points that you share with us is that the previous existence of networks connecting urban and rural areas actually are playing a very important role for the resilience. Sorry. Could you please mute your microphones to avoid background noises? Yeah, sorry. I was just saying that that's a very important point, that the previous existence of those networks connecting urban and rural areas have play a very important role now, for the resilience and in the face of COVID-19, and also like the integration of different actors, everyone contributing according to their capacities and according to their expertise to keep, for example, the supply of goods and foods and health and delivery of health going. So yeah, thank you very much for that, and we will come back later to you to answer some of the questions that the people and our attendees might have for you. So yeah, now I would like to give the floor to our second speaker today, Mario Delos-Reyes from the University of Philippines and co-investigator of the Center for Sustainable, Healthy and Learning Cities and Neighborhoods. So Mario, thank you very much for being today with us. And you have 10 minutes, and looking forward to learn more about the case of in Philippines and the local tiers of government there and the restructuring. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilo. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear, and the presentation as well.
Yeah. So good evening to all from this part of the world. The title of my presentation is on the neighborhood governance and community response to COVID-19 pandemic in the Philippines. Based on the three objectives and guiding questions, I have 4 main points for this presentation. 1, the situation on COVID-19 in the Philippines and the neighborhood governance structure. 2nd, community and neighborhood responses to COVID-19. 3rd, what are the identified urban and rural linkages interventions for COVID-19? And 4th, which is also in the guiding questions, what should be done to strengthen capacities, institutions, and networks, and effectively implement the identified interventions for urban and rural linkages. So this is the timeline of COVID-19 in the Philippines. There are 4 notable points in this timeline. First, in February, the Philippines registered the first death in the world outside China due to COVID-19. Second, the death rate is high, or we could say extremely high, at 6.6% but recently went down to 5.5%. And this is the reason why the Philippine government declared the state of calamity in the country in March. Other countries are only 2 to 3% that rate. So this is also the reason why the Philippine Congress passed the law called the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act. Bayanihan means working together to fight against COVID-19. So the third discussion point is that there are few tests conducted or in the timeline for COVID-19, and contact tracings were not well done. So scientists are in fact questioning the inaccuracy of data from the Philippine Department of Health. So in April, the extension of enhanced community quarantine through May for the selected areas, including Metro Manila. And fourth, I lose my connection, sorry. And fourth, in June, was the easing of the lockdown. However, COVID-19 cases have ups and downs, and the curve has not been flattened yet. So the easing of the lockdown was due to economic reasons. So in the Philippines, we have, as of today, 20,000 plus positive cases, 4,000 plus recovery, and less than 1,000 deaths due to COVID-19. So the proportion of urban population who are informal settlers was a spatial computation made by the Philippine Statistics Authority technical staff using the 2015 census on population. So in 2015, the percentage of population residing in urban areas in the Philippines was recorded at a total of 51.73 million persons resided in barangays classified as urban. So it's approximately 49 to 50% of 100 million population. This means that a total of 1.66 million persons were informal settlers. Estimates of the number of informal settlers vary, with some estimates as high as 2.5 million informal settlers in urban areas. So this image shows that the people on mass exodus to provinces to avoid being locked down in Metro Manila. Only allowed were delivery of food and daily essentials to residents, security, and public health. So now I go to this neighborhood governance structure in the Philippines. The lowest unit of governance structure is what we call barangay or village. And it's mandated to provide, among others, health and social welfare services, which include maintenance of barangay health center and daycare center for children. Likewise, barangays provide services and facilities related to general hygiene and sanitation. So in the Philippines, we have 42,000 barangays. And in Metro Manila alone, we have 1,710 barangays with local autonomy. So these are the people who are in the front line of helping, especially the urban poor in the Philippines. So the president said that the Philippines gave emphasis on the role of barangays or the village governance structure to combat COVID-19. This is in recognition of the important roles that barangays play in the control, prevention, and mitigation of COVID-19 and its impacts. So this is even before COVID-19, barangays have the following: barangay health workers, nutrition scholars, and barangay health emergency response. But in the advent of COVID-19, in many cities, a task force were created to harmonize the efforts as well as organize and strengthen the barangay health emergency response teams. So this now is the popular interventions on COVID-19, which the barangays plays or the village plays a special role, especially in the selection of beneficiaries. One intervention is the 200 billion social amelioration program that will benefit 18 million low-income sector by giving 5,000 to 8,000. This is 80 to 130 pounds per household per month for 2 months. Millions of people went jobless, so they have to be supported through this setup. So likewise, the distribution of rice, canned goods, and other food items. And this is part of the law, which we have, as mentioned earlier, the bayanihan, or the working together to heal as one act in the Philippines. So the other intervention is the Back to the Province New Hope program through the Executive Order 114 signed by the President. And this is to consider that millions of workers were jobless due to COVID-19. So this is to reverse migration to Metro Manila and other congested metropolis, as well as attain rural prosperity through equitable distribution of wealth, resources, opportunities, a balanced regional development program to foster socially cohesive, resilient, and sustainable rural communities. This intervention is a clear manifestation and recognition of the Philippine government of the urban and rural linkages, even in the time of COVID-19. So we have, you know, that we have 8 million overseas Filipino workers, and even 1/4 of that is 2 million who will be coming back to the Philippines. And you know how much problems in labor sector we will be facing. So that is the reason why they are going back to the province. But there are, of course, the implementation of programs has also encountered challenges, which include the apparent unclear coordination with the local government units that will host who are availing the program. So a lot of community-based organization, faith-based organization. One example is the Gawad Kalinga, or Caring for the Poor. This is a neighborhood faith-based organization popular in the Philippines on the many programs conducted, especially in this COVID-19 pandemic. So as an example is that they have this program on mushroom growing, mushroom farming, and orchidarium, and also all these programs that will help. There's a tagline here that hunger ends where caring begins, or no left behind in the fighting of COVID-19. So, and other programs. So, and we have our group, Center for Neighborhood Studies, identified urban and regional linkages. And these are one intervention. So one is to integrate mobility and transport planning and in land use, and then revisit the delineation of administrative regions to facilitate the ridge to reef planning. I just, because I don't have the time, so I will not anymore expound this. Reimagine comprehensive land use planning and spatial planning to include neighborhood planning. This is what we want to espouse. Consider value chain development of neighborhood economic activities. Empower micro, small, and medium enterprises through fully integrated value chain linkages, which is forward and backward, and promote efficient densities and in urban areas. My last slide. Lastly, and in the final analysis, to effectively implement the identified interventions for urban and rural linkages, the following have to be done to strengthen capacities, institutions, and networks for urban and rural linkages. So one, design barangays or village in terms of human scale and walkability, because the barangays are really full of people. And how can you practice social distancing? Establish barangay neighborhood-based population register so that there will be information on internal migration. Third, fast track the implementation of community-based monitoring through technology and through data generation. Fourth, harmonize legal frameworks and administrative arrangement. Fifth, focus on the role of national government in empowering neighborhoods. Sixth, upscaling of neighborhood level innovation. And last, promote urban agriculture and agrihood. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mario. Just on time.
Yeah.
So
sorry, I'm very fast because of the lack of time.
Yeah, I know that you provided a lot of information, and definitely we need more time to go and discuss each one of the points that you just shared with us. Just to share one of the things that remain with me, I find very interesting, as you were saying, like the role that are play in the barangays, this tier of local government, a special tier of local government in the Philippines at the neighborhood level. But although you translate it as a village governance structure, and the role that playing now. Also, I find it very interesting, like what you mentioned, the recognition of Philippines government of the urban-rural linkages with the back to the province policy. That's actually one of the things that we have been like discussing and also seeing during the COVID-19 is the reverse migration from urban to rural areas, and this policy already existed before the COVID-19. Actually want to strengthen this link that usually is stronger, like from rural to urban than urban to rural. So that's a very important point, and I think to highlight. And you mentioned also like the different communities, organizations that working at the neighborhood level, like with different initiatives to support the value chains across the urban and rural. So yeah, thank you very much. And then in the discussion, I'm sure that there are many questions for you. So also I would like to encourage our attendees to use the chat box to express your thoughts, opinions, questions, whatever you want to share, and to enrich the discussion today. So yeah, so now I would like to give the floor to our third speaker, Erika Salem, is Program Officer at the organization Montréal and Santé in Montreal, Canada. So Erika, thank you for being today with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Camilo. I will try to share my presentation. I have two screens, so just give me a minute. All right. So Montréal Métropole en Santé is actually Healthy Montreal. I think I have the same problem as as our colleague.
So Alice, my colleague who is supporting us, can display the presentation for you.
I would love to share my presentation, though. I don't know if this works now. Just
we
a
can
second.
try again.
Yes, please. If I'm good enough, I will make it work. All right, I think it works. Does it? Nope. Okay, then I will just accept that this is not working then.
And now it's working.
But still, it still shows as
yeah.
Oh well.
Okay,
can you please put it up for me?
Yeah. So Alice, please display the presentation. Okay.
Yes, just a second. I'm all right. So thank you very much for inviting me. Today I will present you the case of food security in Montreal and how the neighborhood governance and community response organized towards the pandemic. You can change. I will try to go quite fast to go through everything. So I will present 5 elements. The original, well, I will start with the original settings of what is going on as the community organizations and food security in Montreal before the pandemic. We already had the great organizations working. So I will present that, and then we'll see how the crisis impact these food emergency aid organizations and what was the regional local response to it. And then we'll see what's the role of governance and the community for a resilient food system. So we had a lot of people involved for food security in Montreal before the crisis at different levels. We had the provincial government with its regional public health department that was very active with supporting local organizations with funding and action plans and projects. And then we had the City of Montreal funding organizations too. We had the United Way with a lot of funding. It's the most important organization that was providing 50 millions a year. And but the most important, I would say, was Moisson Montréal, which is the regional food bank that was organizing already food redistribution from grocery stores and different inputs from food to the local community organizations. So they had 241 accredited organizations to whom they were delivering food. Then we have different levels of governance with the regional level, with the Montreal Food Policy Council, which I support through my work. And we had 30 neighborhoods community councils that were acting at the neighborhood level for collaborations between neighborhood community organizations. And then we had more than 600 local community organizations that were active, more or less active, depending, in Montreal. We can skip. So what happened on March 16, we had the confinement measures that were imposed by the provincial government. And then on March 28, we had an inter-regional movement restricted by the government. So these measures really put pressure on the food availability because one of the measures was the closure of the restaurants, bars, and cafes. So all the citizens were suddenly had no alternatives, and they had to go to the grocery stores. But it was still very hard because of the social distancing measures within the grocery stores. It was hard to access them. And then people were piling up a lot of food. So there was a momentary lack of food basics because of the just-in-time way of working in the grocery stores. And then we've seen at we have a system that is called 211, which is like 911, but for community services. It's a community resource directory. And the calls for food aid really surged. We've seen that it was the most important reason for calling. The citizens were really calling there to know where to get emergency food aid more than anything else. And then, well, the local community organizations, many of them had to close because most of them they were working with elderly people as volunteers. So elderly people suddenly stayed home. There was a very big surge in demand for food aid, and there was a new increased need for delivery services. So many local community organizations closed because they had no more volunteers. Some of them suddenly started to do food aid. Some of them started to do deliveries. We can skip. So we can skip that. It was just to show how the food needs were important. So 5% of the Montrealers reported that they lacked food, and 43% of them reported that it was because of a lack of financial resources. But the most important thing is to understand that most of these 5% were not experiencing food insecurity before the crisis. So there was a surge of new people that needed food emergency aid. We can skip to the next. So as I said, there were different challenges to food security. We had an increased need for supplies. The local organization needed protection equipment, which they didn't have and was really difficult to access. There was a lack of volunteers, and then you had to deal with the social distancing measures. So they couldn't, even if there was a lot of volunteers ready to help, it was impossible to bring them in because of the, social distancing measures. There was an increased need for deliveries, and most of the organizations had not that capacity. And then there was the school closure, which ended the food aid programs for kids. So we had the children also needing food aid. We can skip. So there was a regional and local response. Very quickly at the regional level, many organizations, well, all the organizations that I've presented you at the very beginning, pulled themselves together. So institutions from the government, the philanthropic organizations and community partners pulled themselves together to try to understand what was going on. We needed to collect the data because we didn't know which organizations were actually functioning and delivering food aid to the people. And then we need to follow up with the challenges of these organizations. Who was experiencing what were their needs, so we could channel the right aid to them, with whether it's human or financial aid. And we had to optimize the food distribution mechanism, and we tried to identify alternatives. There were many alternatives that were put up, and we tried to collaborate with different private sector, public sector, any actors that was able to help. We tried to coordinate new innovative responses. We can change. So there was many innovative responses by different actors. So we can see Montreal City start distributing free food to homeless people in 5 parks. The Montreal boroughs, the actual governmental institutions, started funding new funds for community organizations. And then many NGOs and local organizations started to work regionally. So for example, we have La Table des Chefs, who started to really coordinate a response and mobilize the restaurant chefs to provide meals to the needy. So 1.6 million meals were and are still cooked by volunteers, chefs at the moment. So many more initiatives were put up at the regional level. We can skip. There was also a very, very quick citizen responses. And as Maria Teresa mentioned, I think it's really important to mention the importance of social media and how it was a very great tool for citizen coordination and responses. So many mutual aid groups were put up, but mostly the one that you see here is the regional one, but every single neighborhood had their own group. So people could actually exchange information and provide help to each other. There is a very important group of cycling people who organized themselves very quickly and started to provide the delivery, food aid delivery for the community organizations. So this is still working now at the moment. And then we have a lot of artisanal protective face mask production that is providing the community organizations. Let's skip. So there are many risks related to the local food system. First, we mentioned it, there's a general dependency on imported food. And we've seen that the industrial agriculture sector here is very dependent on the foreign workers. So that's one of the pressure that hasn't been felt in the city, but we could see it in the outskirts. It hasn't impacted our capacity to deliver food security in the city, but still it's an economical problem. And then small organic farmers, they were really impacted because the restaurants were their most important clients and they lost them in one day to the other. So there is a very strong need to improve their capacity for the local organic farmers and just local farmers in general to improve their capacity to access public spaces to sell their products. And then, but still, citizens responded to the crisis in one way. Well, the wealthier citizens were started to really subscribe to local farming organic basket. Do I still have time, Camilo?
1 minute.
All right, perfect. And well, one need was, let's say, the needs that we need to do in Montreal. We need to provide funding to local community organizations as an essential service to the people, because we've seen that they were at the front line, and the funding is really still not enough, even if it's great here. We need more communication and coordination. The coordination was great, but still there was a lack of relation between the regional level and the local level, and we tried to address that, but there's really a better way to do this with probably online platforms and maybe logistic tools, and really use technology a little bit more. And finally, we could have a urban agriculture plan for Montreal and greenhouses that would really provide during all year long way more very local products. So I have many things to say still, but this would wrap up my presentation. We can hear you, Camilo. I think you're on mute. I still can't hear you.
Yeah, so I was saying that thank you for your presentation, and we can come back to some of the points that you couldn't address in your presentation, although I think it was very clear in the discussion time. So to highlight one of the things that you share with us today is this new needs that the pandemic created in Montreal, specifically because there was a lack of, let's say, workforce that was removed, like elderly had to go I think in quarantine, and many of the community organizations couldn't work anymore, and this provoked a reorganization and cooperation between different levels of governments. Even some organizations had to go to operate to a bigger scale, at a regional scale. So yeah, thank you very much for this. I want to give the floor to our fourth speaker today, Francis Levira. Francis belongs to the Ifakara Health Institute in Tanzania, and also is a co-investigator of the Center for Sustainable, Healthy and Learning Cities and Neighborhoods. Francis, it's a pleasure to having you here today, and yeah, please go ahead. The floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes. Francis, can you hear me?
Okay, can you hear me there?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And is my presentation visible?
Yeah, it is just displayed as full screen, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Francis Levira. On behalf of my team in Tanzania, I would like to present on Tanzanian experience with regards to urban-rural linkages in the time of COVID-19. So I'm going to present the case of Dar es Salaam. So this is the experience from Dar es Salaam, but it was also experienced from many parts of Tanzania and urban areas. So the content of my presentation, I will start by giving an overview on the governance structures in terms of local government and health system provision. And the next one is on urban neighborhoods. And classification and the linkages. The third will be on pandemic response in terms of governance. And the other one will be on pandemic response on preventive measures. Then on pandemic response in terms of treatment, and lastly on challenges. So in terms of governance structure, the government of Tanzania is organized into different ministries. So if you look at the chart, you have government of Tanzania, and then below it you have a ministry that is responsible for the local government. So it is under President Office. So we call it President Office, Regional Administration and Local Government. And below that, you have now regions as administrative areas. And below regions, you have districts. So there are districts in the rural and district in the urban. So when you come to the urban districts, then you have municipal, or we normally call them districts, and then you have wards, and then the last one in terms of neighborhood is street, which is what we will consider in this presentation as neighborhoods. So in terms of health service provision structure, we have two major ministries responsible for that. You have Ministry of Health, Community Development, Gender and Children, and then you have President Office, Regional Administration, Local Government. So when you look at this organization, then you find that the Ministry of Health is responsible for the administration of different departments like medical store departments, health insurance, and then you have the ministry also is responsible for overseeing the specialized hospitals and referral hospitals, and then we have regional hospitals that also are supported by the Ministry of Health. And then you have the President Office, Regional Administration and Local Government, which is actually responsible for the implementation of routine activities like district hospitals. And then you have primary health facilities like dispensaries, district hospitals, and such. And then you have other ministries that are responsible for the financing, Ministry of Finance, and the other ministries. So in terms of staffing at different levels, at the district level, we have government employees. At the district level, you have district executive directors, and there are employed staffs in all sectors. And at the political level, we have member of parliament. So per district, you may have one or more than one member of parliament. So when it comes to the lower level, which is ward, then we have ward executive officer. So ward, as I said, is a combination of different neighborhoods or streets. And within wards, we have about 3 or 4 government employee positions. We normally have health officer, education officer, a community development person, and 1 or 2 more employed staff at the level of ward. So down at the bottom on the neighborhood, which is actually the street, we have only 1 employed person, which is the street executive officer or neighborhood executive officer, only 1 person. So you can start imagining on the staffing side of it. So in terms of how the cities are organized, we have different neighborhood classification. We have already analyzed our data, and you can see the map here are different types of neighborhood, starting from the low income neighborhoods to the super or high income neighborhoods. So in Dar es Salaam, we have currently 5 municipals or wards, And actually the last 2 ones were divided from the other 3. So we don't have actual number of wards and street. So in terms of urban-rural linkages, the linkages are major for coming from the labor market. So the rural would normally supply cheap labor to the urban. Some people are moving to the urban due to the economic opportunities, so it is back and forth. And we have internal tourists, people who are just coming to Dar es Salaam to visit their neighborhood. We have also education that is also increasing the flow. Many institutions, high institutions are in Dar es Salaam, and people are maintaining their family ties. So people will go to the rural, and the rural people will come to the urban. So most migrants are living with their relatives, especially in people of the low class. So you can see relatives, proportion of relatives compared to the children, it's almost 75% of people are living as relatives in low income household compared to the high income household in class 6, where number of relatives or proportion of relatives compared to children are slightly low. So when it comes to the pandemic responses, in terms of governance, we didn't have a specific governance structure to deal with this one. So the country has to establish different committees. Actually, there were 3. So starting with the bottom one is the National Task Force that was consisting of a permanent secretary from different ministries. And then we have the top above it was permanent secretarial committees. These are technical people. And then on top, we had a national response committee, which was actually consist of very, very top government officials. So in terms of preventive measures, the government decided to go on more of a preventive measure. So we didn't have any lockdown. There was actually a scaled up of education campaigns, economic activities a little bit slowed, but everything continued as usual. Hygienic practice were insisted, and many places were closed, education institution and many other gatherings were actually prohibited. So economic activities continued as usual. So people had to make their own mask, and washing hands was actually promoted a lot. So in terms of treatment in Dar es Salaam regions, large public hospitals were designated for dealing with the pandemic. We had different sample collection points, and actually a lot of stigma was also observed, and also the government decided to release some different form of medications. So lastly, in terms of challenges and things that needs to be addressed, including limited funding on education campaigns, as there was no sufficient funding to support that. There was no actually social and subsidies for poor families. As I said, economic activities a little bit slowed down. So some people were laid off, but there was no any support. We also had lack of capacities in terms of testing. We only had one lab that was responsible for testing the entire country. And we had a lot of challenges in terms of the government accepting the diagnostic that were instituted by were important. So there was a lot of challenges in terms of agreeing on whether those testing equipment were sufficient. So in summary, I can say there was a challenge, but because there was no any lockdown, most economic activities continued as usual. We didn't have any food challenges as experienced with many other countries. So that is the end of my presentation. In short, if there are any questions, I would love to hear from the team. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Francis, for this comprehensive overview of the case in Dar es Salaam. Yes, I'm sure that there are many questions I can see here in the chat. Questions for you, but now I would like to go to the discussion. And I have been trying to track all the interesting discussion also happening in the chat, and I see that there are questions and regarding, for example, this discussion is more about like a cooperation of many actors, and one of the questions that have been posted in the chat is the ideas that the speakers can share with us to enhance this cooperation and the multi-actor setting that we are seeing now in Bolivia, in Montreal, in Dar es Salaam, and also in the Philippines. What ideas are to enhance the cooperation between actors, but also what are the challenges in mobilizing these initiatives together. So I would like to start talking about these questions of integrated governance and mobilizing these complex networks of actors, giving the floor to Maria Teresa. Would you like to start?
Sure, my pleasure. Oh, I'm sorry, can you rephrase that for me?
The question: what are the challenges mobilizing that you have seen mobilizing these complex multi-actor settings that spread across the urban and rural areas, and also what ideas can you share with us to enhance the cooperation between communities, levels of governments, private sector, and also foundations? And yeah.
Sure. Well, I think there's several challenges, but I would like to highlight that I think that given the fact that the pandemic caught us all off guard, I will say that I'm very pleased and I'm very impressed by the way that different organizations and public and private forces have been able to organize to make sure, even though if not in a coordinated manner, but they have been able to organize within their own sectors to deploy different measures and initiatives. I think one of the greatest challenges in Bolivia is the fact that we have very weak institutions. But at the same time, that has made sure that the population, whether organized or unorganized, has developed capacities to kind of care for itself, precisely because, you know, institutions are so weak, and we don't tend to have governments that really generate platforms for multi-sectoral initiatives to come together and, you know, implement coordinated planning and then implementation strategies. I think another one of the challenges is that Bolivia has very low levels of infrastructure. So in terms of, you know, urban-rural linkages, and in terms of, you know, ensuring and fostering these strengthened local food supply systems, I think, you know, there needs to be a lot of work in terms of infrastructure. And unfortunately, as we all know, infrastructure is not something that you really can guarantee in the short term. I mean, they tend to be projects that are implemented over the course of years. But I do think that in this case, because civil society organizations had been working on these short circuit market chains for a very long time, in this context, these actors and these chains have come out to the light. And it's been really interesting because that has also allowed more visibility of these actors and more visibility of their needs. And so it's been really interesting to see that for the first time in a long time, we're actually listening to the voices of the rural area and asking, you know, what do you need in order to keep feeding the people of Bolivia in the face of this pandemic and the interruption of, international food commerce and other type of commerce. So it's been interesting also to see the government starting to mobilize resources to support family agriculture, for example. So again, in terms of, governance, again, I think, there's a long road that needs to be traveled in Bolivia in terms of governance, in terms of, multi-sectoral coordination. But again, I think that the lack of governance has actually led to organizations developing capacities to implement strategies, regardless of whether government is paying attention or not. And I think that's been really interesting. And now we're hoping that, in the face of the pandemic, we'll start to see the development of these platforms where, either, where different sectors can come together, whether with or without the government, but the rest of the sectors are actually interested in coming together to coordinate, especially knowing that this is not the only quarantine that we're going to live through, and that the pandemic is not going away tomorrow. So I think people are really starting to rethink a lot of things.
Thank you very much, Maria Teresa. I think you provide us like very important points and insights. Yeah, very concrete. Like also the need to have a support, institutional support, to generate these initiatives of multi-actor settings, and also the lack of infrastructure. I think also the discussion in this way in the regarding infrastructure, also it has to do a lot now regarding digitalization. As Erika mentioned, and also we have seen this topic of digitalization in past webinars, that is not only about like the raw infrastructures, like providing networks, but also expanded that to like training, and the training for the people to use the tools. So yeah, that's thank you for sharing that with us. There are more questions for you if we have time. I will go back to you, but now I would like to ask the same question to Mario, because also you mentioned that in Philippines, like there is also a very, like it's a strong network of actors at the local level, and there is a, let's say, a formal governmental tier at that level. So in that case, Maria Teresa just mentioned that it's important, this institutional support. So I would like to ask that the same question for you, Mario. How is it the situation in Philippines? What are the challenges mobilizing like this setting of actors that are across the urban-rural continuum, and also what are the ideas to enhance the cooperation?
Yeah, thank you, Camilo. We have a lot of problems. Most of these initiatives or interventions mobilizing multi-actors have a lot of problems. We are beset with problems. Like, for example, in the implementation of the Social Amelioration Fund, where 18 million low-income sectors will receive at least 80 pounds to 130 pounds. That really depends on where they are in the economic region. So some low income, they said they haven't received this support coming from the government. Others, they said that they have, they are not expecting what they have. They want to receive 88,000 pesos, but they have received only 3,000 or 4,000. These are problems that they have encountered. And we could, I think, what are the strategies? I have to go back to my last slide, that we have to upscale our neighborhood level innovations, especially in fast-tracking the implementation of community-based monitoring system. So we can generate data, like, for example, identify these people so that nobody will be left out. Who are the real people, who are the real low-income sector who should receive this social amelioration fund. The next problem of intervention is on the back to the province. this program, according to some of the local government units in the cities and municipalities in that province, they said that they are not coordinated, well coordinated with the local government units to those recipient LGUs, local government unit. So really database, community-based monitoring system, that should be, and then focus on the role of national government in empowering neighborhoods, empowering communities, empowering barangays or villages. I hope I will stop there. Thank you, Camilo.
Yeah, thank you, Mario. Definitely, I think this issue of monitoring systems to identify needs, it's a very important one, and also it's the question about how to do that and use the tools and the new technologies that are available for that. But it's very complex, I can imagine. Yeah. So I would like to also touch on another set of questions that I have seen in the chat, and also this has to do with actors that now are becoming visible, as for example, as Maria Teresa said, that giving the visibility to these actors is also giving the visibility to the linkages that are between urban and rural areas. And I would like to ask Erika, in the case of Montreal, if indigenous groups have been integrated in these networks supporting the flows of food, or with other, I mean, not only indigenous group, but I think we have seen that now this is about also that inclusion of other actors that are now playing a vital role.
Yes, well, regarding the indigenous groups, it's a difficult question, because in Montreal, when you have indigenous people in Montreal, most of them, unfortunately, are in the street, are homeless. They're people that come from the up north villages. They come to the city to get different services, sometimes to change their lifestyles. And they end up, most of the time, unfortunately, they end up in the street. So we have specialized community organizations for them, but they've been, the response they have received was from the city. There was one park that is very well known in the west south side of the city, where they gather most of the time. That's one of the park that was that started to do food distribution, and there was also social workers that were sent there to make sure that they have services. But it's really something that has to be addressed more and more, and it's systemic. For the minorities, well, I don't like minorities, let's say different communities. We know that the poor people in Montréal Nord, which is where mostly Asian people and immigrate, where there's a lot of immigration that is concentrate there. There was an important impact of the COVID there. People got, it's complicated to explain, but these people were sent at the front line. Actually, they were already at the front line, serving elderly people in the hospitals and in hospices. It's very difficult work that was actually done by illegal immigrants. It was a work that was done by people who crossed the frontier and couldn't find work because it's really not well paid. And these are the people who were at the front line, who got COVID because of the difficult work structure that were in the hospitals and hospices. So the COVID really went through these neighborhoods really quickly, but the solidarity and responses were actually very well structured there. And we have a lot of, the response was really more, was quicker in these neighborhoods. But yeah, it's a very long answer, very long question to answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Erika.
Your mic is on mute.
Again, thank you. And now I would like to go to our fourth speaker, Francis. There are some questions for you, and one is regarding the role of just 1 minute. I forgot, but I just want to inform, like in the chat also is the question, like the situation that have been experiencing in the African context. I see here that, for example, somebody shared that example of Kampala, that the spread of the virus, let's say, hindered or prevent. One moment, sorry. The question is this one, sorry. So in a previous session of the webinar, we see that for example, in contexts like Kenya, first, many inhabitants of cities wanted to go back to rural areas. So could you please tell more us how this was in Dar es Salaam, but at the same time, because the lockdown prevented that, but because in the city, in the rural areas, we'll have to have a source of income, like because provided by agricultural activities, and we have seen this reverse urban to rural migration pattern. So what is the case in Dar es Salaam?
Yes, okay, thank you. I think there was no much desire for people to go back to rural areas, because if you look at other African countries' experiences, they did have a lockdown. But I mean, you can imagine the decision of the government of Tanzania not to do a lockdown, because I think the government was not able to provide and feed everybody in the country, especially majority, as you know, majority are poor. So if you do a lockdown, you have to feed everybody, and that was not possible. So the government decided to take a decision that there will be no lockdown, but increasing more of preventive measures by closing schools. Once you close schools, then the people and population in the town would really go down. So we don't have much experience of people wanting to go back to the rural. And actually, majority of COVID infections were in Dar es Salaam. So in other regions, there were like very, very few. But I can say maybe more than 95% of infections were in large cities, especially Dar es Salaam. So there was no demand and need for people to go back to rural areas.
Pretty interesting, actually, because in other cases that we've seen, that there was the rural areas have actually a pull factor for many people to, regarding, for example, food security. But yes, thank you for your question. Now I remember that I wanted to ask you as well, like, is the role about this, the role of these street executive officers. Could you please tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is one person.
Sorry, very quickly, we're approaching to the end of the webinar.
Yeah, okay, so this is one person who is responsible for several households, sometimes from 500 and more, but I mean, their roles were to connect residents within the neighborhood to the higher government levels. So for example, if you want, for example, to own a land, you have to face and meet those people. And once you meet them, they will actually direct you to the higher government level and actually introduce you. So in terms of health-related issues, I think these people are responsible also for making sure that all the neighborhoods are clean and everything is well organized, things like sanitation. So, I mean, this is one person with the committee and they receive very little funding. So, I mean, their functions are quite very limited.
Thank you very much, Francis, for that. So yes, now we are approaching to the end of the webinar. I just want to close the discussion. Just calling once again our speakers. If you like, in no more than 30 seconds, can you give us like some takeaways to close this session? So if you want, I can start again with Maria Teresa, please.
I just think it's great to see that regardless of our differences around the world, at the end of the day, we have the same needs and we kind of resort to the same mechanisms to problem solve. And I think that's very interesting. And I think that actually technology helps us identify those similarities more than ever before. So I think there's so much that we can do together. And despite the fact that many of us are in confinement and we feel isolated at times, either as people or as communities or as countries, I think actually technology in this day and age really allows us to reach out to each other and ask for help and innovate together. I think, you know, increasingly the technology divide in terms of, you know, gadgets is so much smaller than before. And that's so empowering to communities. And I think that the underlying lessons that come out in these situations is the need for solidarity, and not only amongst ourselves, but among, you know, rural and urban communities. Actually, we have been divided for so long, and I think once again this is a great opportunity for us to rethink about our internal relations between our different types of territories. And so, you know, I wanted to say thank you to UN Habitat once again, and actually thanks to my co-presenters, because I think I've learned a lot. It's been so interesting to see that we're organized in very similar ways, and we're deploying initiatives in a similar fashion, because at the end of the day, I think we just want everybody to be okay. And I think that that's what makes us humans. And I think in the face of what's also happening in the United States and these divides that are really coming to light, I think it's important to really think about how we can come back together as a race on this planet. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria Teresa. Mario, would you like to share like no more than 30 seconds, please? Like
Yeah.
some takeaways from us.
Yeah, I think we need to collaborate with government, with the private sector, with the community-based organization. There are a lot of things going on. With this pandemic virus, a lot of people are helping each other. And we might be also beneficiaries, but we can be also benefactors in helping others, especially the low-income, these marginalized people of our society. I think that's all.
Thank you, Mario. Erika, would you like to continue?
Yes, so well, I think urban planning has to be way more focused on food access and make sure that the family producers in the outskirts of the city are able to access the urban space and sell their products. And I think we have to, at the different levels, be more focused on collaboration and transparency, sharing the data, making sure we use the online platforms, and making the data available between the organizations and institutions. It's really crucial to make great decisions. And finally, it's in these times of crisis and very disturbing times, I think food brings people together, and it can actually be super inspiring to see all the solidarity that is taking place between the citizens and between the organizations, and really to see how there is innovation and response, beautiful responses to bring basic needs to the people, to answer their needs.
Thank you, Erika. Francis?
Yeah, thank you. I think for most of people in recent ages, we have experienced the impact of this global pandemic that has never happened in recent years. So, I mean, when it comes to urban-rural linkages, I think we have learned a lot, and we have now a task on doing something on global health security, because that should be now a priority, because it's quite hard to deal with this one. We cannot continue with a lockdown for a year or so. I mean, even for 6 months, it's almost impossible. So this provides us with an opportunity to review our global health security agenda in different countries and at the global level in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francis. So yes, now I would like to give the floor back again to Remy Setchepin, who will share with us like closing remarks for this webinar. Remy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks, Camilo. Thanks, my colleagues. Thanks all the presenters and contributors, discussants. I think it was yet again a very rich a platform to share different perspectives. I just want to take a few minutes to some keywords, not take away messages, but just keywords that are worth noticing moving forward. The importance of multi-level governance, and here by governance, I heard a lot about formal and informal, how they need to work together. So this is very critical, and this COVID-19 had given us the opportunity to test that. And to that, also learn that it's important. The second keyword here being resilient, that at the local level, they seem to be resilient, especially when institutions are weak. I heard the third keyword, which was really community-based organization and interest groups, how they play a very important role to structure and strengthen local governance in all the cases that were presented. The fourth word that I noted down was technology. How, in this context of COVID, the social media, how we have been able to learn from each other to connect had been so powerful. If there is another word that I would like to, maybe the last one, is in relation to one. I heard a lot about one community, one territory, one humanity. We are all one being, and through that issue of health, food systems, migration, and the sheer fact that we are all human makes a lot of sense. And this is, again, a call for us to be acquire cognition of the importance of the humanity beyond urban and rural, but really the quest for us to work as human beings regardless of where we are in a country or not. All right, so thanks again. And Camilo will take over to inform us on the next webinar, or what's happening next. But I just want to throw something here that I've seen a lot of discussion and questions on the chat bar that we may not have addressed. We will do our best to extract those questions and send to the presenters or discussants if they can actually look into them. So again, thank you very much, and until next time, bye for now. Back to you, Camilo.
Thank you, Remy, for sharing that with us. For these closing remarks, that actually are closing this first session, this first webinar series on urban-rural linkages. We are going to take a break 1 week, and then we will come back with a second webinar series addressing new topics. And yeah, thank you for all the persons that joined us today. Just for you to save the date, next session of the webinar series will happen on June the 18th. And yes, we will keep you posted. We'd like to thank you again for all the people that connected today from all over the world, our speakers, and also our partners organizing this webinar, from the Center for Sustainable, Healthy and Learning Cities and Neighborhoods. So yeah, thank you very much. And also, yeah, of course, my colleagues at Urban-Rural Linkages team. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.